December 17, 1944. The Ardennes groaned beneath the twin weights of snow and war. Naked trees stood like grave markers, their branches shuddering at each distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere near Bastogne, a Sherman tank crouched behind a shallow ridge, its armor trembling against the cold, its crew locked in the kind of silence that only comes before death. Inside, for men sweated beneath layers of wool and fear. Their breath fogged the air like ghosts. The main gun had barked over 24 times that morning. The loader's arms burned, the gunner's nerves hung by a thread. But the worst enemy wasn't the frost, nor the panzers circling through the trees. It was the silence, because they were almost out of ammunition. The .50 cal on top was dry. The coaxial gun had only a handful of rounds left. The belts, those precious, fabric-linked veins of fire, had jammed twice already, frozen stiff in the biting wind. No resupply, no radio, no hope. Their commander stared through a cracked periscope at the wrecks of American trucks smoldering down the road. His lips were split and bleeding when he muttered, "This is it." Then the loader, 22-year-old Calvin Briggs, farm boy from rural Kentucky, reached under his seat and pulled out a burlap sack. Inside was something strange. Not army issue, not standard. It looked handmade. Strips of cotton cloth, uneven but careful. Loops stitched by hand, each holding a brass cartridge as if it were gold. The gunner snorted. "That thing again?" Calvin didn't answer. He just fed it into the receiver. He had sewn it by candlelight night after night, when the others slept. They had called it hillbilly engineering. Now it was all they had left. When he pressed the trigger, the Sherman came alive. The barrel screamed, spitting fire for 4 unbroken hours. It wasn't luck, it was design. Calvin's design. Before the snow, before the war turned boys into smoke and men into steel, there was Calvin Briggs. Born in 1922 in Lyon County, Kentucky. The son of a farmer who fixed everything twice before buying it once. Calvin's hands were scarred and strong by the time he was 10. Not from battle, but from turning wrenches and hammering life back into broken tools. He could mend a fence with barbed wire and a belt buckle. Weld a cracked axle with scrap metal and a prayer. By 17, he'd built a working engine from junkyard parts and faith alone. He wasn't just clever, he was driven. He read popular mechanics like scripture, walked miles to county fairs to watch engines roar to life. When the war headlines came, he studied them the way farmers study the sky before a storm. So when Pearl Harbor burned, Calvin didn't hesitate. He enlisted the next day, not out of fury, nor blind patriotism, but conviction. War, he believed, was the ultimate machine. Terrible, relentless, and maybe, if he could understand it, he could keep it from breaking too many lives. He trained as a tank mechanic but volunteered for the front lines, insisting that the best way to fix what breaks is to be there when it breaks. His officers thought him strange, quiet, methodical, always tinkering. But in North Africa, he turned artillery shells into a makeshift water boiler. In Sicily, he fixed a broken track using wine barrel bands. And as the Allies clawed through France, his name began to spread from platoon to platoon. Calvin Briggs didn't talk big. He fixed big. But his greatest invention didn't come from a battlefield. It came from boredom and observation. By late 1944, he had seen enough jammed machine gun belts to know that standard army designs froze solid in the cold. The metal warped. The cloth stiffened. The guns went silent when they were needed most. So Calvin began to sew. He tore strips from spare uniforms, canvas from seat covers, even shoelaces and twine. He stitched them together by hand, using a bullet casing as a spacer and a ruler he carved himself. The others mocked him, called it Calvin's country quilt. He didn't argue. He never did. He just kept working one loop at a time, until the day that handmade belts saved an entire crew and turned a farm boy's stubbornness into a legend whispered through the snow-choked woods of Bastogne. He had tested it once during drills, loaded the strange, stitched belt into the backup gun. It fed smoother than any standard issue belt. No jam, no snag, just clean, rhythmic fire that felt almost too perfect. Still, no one took it seriously. The quartermaster refused to log it. The lieutenant smirked and said, "Not regulation, Briggs. Save it for the county fair." So Calvin folded his invention, slid it back into a burlap sack, and tucked it under his seat. A footnote. A hobby. He had no idea it would become the one thing standing between life and death. War has a cruel habit of turning the absurd into essential. And in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, That sack of stitched cotton was about to become the most important weapon on the battlefield. By December 1944, the Allies believed victory was within reach. Normandy had been taken. Paris was free. The German army was in retreat, broken, bleeding, desperate. Soldiers whispered that they'd be home by Christmas. They were wrong. On December 16th, Hitler struck back. 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and endless barrages of artillery thundered into the Ardennes. The attack was sudden, ruthless, and utterly unexpected. The last gamble of a dying empire, and it hit the thin American lines like a hammer through glass. Within days, the front dissolved into chaos. Trucks carrying winter gear never arrived. Fuel convoys vanished in ambushes. Ammunition dumps exploded in the distance, leaving only fire and silence. Radios crackled and died. Engines froze solid. Steel coffins in the snow. For men like Calvin Briggs, the war had turned into something primal, an endurance test between machine and cold. Oil thickened to tar. Batteries bled out their charge in minutes. Grease hardened around gears like cement. Even the act of feeding a belt into a gun became a ritual of frustration and frostbite. The standard belts, fabric with metal links spaced for .50 caliber rounds, had been designed for deserts and dust, not ice and fog. In the Ardennes, they turned brittle. Moisture froze inside the loops. The metal warped. One pull of the trigger and the belt jammed tight. Crews improvised. Some warmed belts against the tank's engine block. Others rubbed them with oil or wrapped them in scarves. Nothing worked for long. Within minutes of firing, friction and frost fused the belts into useless tangles. And in tank warfare, a jammed gun was a death sentence. Seconds could decide everything, whether a crew lived or vanished under German fire. Across the forest, entire armored units were dying not because they lacked courage, but because their machines refused to obey. One tanker would later write home, "We weren't fighting Germans. We were fighting the weather, the roads, and the fact that nothing we had worked the way it should." That was the world Calvin Briggs woke into that morning. No replacement belts were coming. The resupply convoy had been ambushed. Out of 8 trucks, 2 made it through. The rest burned somewhere near Malmedy. His Sherman, callsign Lion Charlie 4, had less than 200 rounds left for the machine guns. Half of it was already jammed in useless belts. The rest lay loose and cold on the floor, impossible to feed without proper rigging. Still, they rolled forward. Because someone had to. Because there was no one else left to hold that line. As the gray sky deepened and snow began to fall heavier, Calvin understood what war had become. It wasn't about tactics or generals anymore. It was about who could keep their machine alive the longest. And beneath his seat, folded in a burlap sack, was the thing everyone had mocked. The thing that no one believed in, and the only thing that might just save them all. Nobody had logged it. Nobody had approved it. Nobody had even looked at it twice. A homemade ammo belt, stitched by numb fingers and too much spare time, folded into a burlap sack beneath a seat. A ridiculous little thing that, in a few hours, would be the thin line between 4 men and nothing at all. The army doesn't have room for the unconventional. Uniformity is survival. Regulation is scripture. Anyone who colors outside those lines gets scorn, not support. Calvin learned that fast. He'd first shown the prototype during a lull in a muddy orchard near the French border. The crew sipped bitter coffee from tin cups beneath a sky the color of old bone. Calvin, proud but quiet, held the cloth band up like a small miracle. It looked laughable, worn cotton loops, rough but reinforced stitching, waxed and greased to stay pliable in cold weather. He explained calmly why the issued belts froze, how the fabric absorbed moisture and stiffened, how he'd measured spacing by hand and tested dummy rounds until the feed was flawless. They laughed. The driver joked, "What is that? A scarf for bullets?" The gunner hoisted his cup like a priest and sneered, "You sewing for the Red Cross now?" Lieutenant Jarvis, Ohio regulation, buzzcut, a man who trusted orders more than invention, raised an eyebrow and walked away. "It's not Army-issued, Briggs," he said. "There's a reason for that." Even when Calvin demonstrated the feed, how the round slid cleanly into the loops, how the belt coiled without kinking, how it outperformed the brittle metal links in a cold test, they shrugged. Not cruelty, exhaustion. After months of war, men cling to the familiar, even if it fails them. That night Calvin sat alone by the tank and folded the belt into the burlap. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He kept working. While others drank or played cards, he tested cloth types, mixed waxes, rethought stitch patterns, scoured duffel sacks for stronger loops. He became the quiet joke. Shoulda used Briggs' quilt. Yet no one threw it away. They teased, and still, in some private place, they kept it near. The quartermaster refused to log it. "We're not running a haberdashery," he barked. A sergeant joked Calvin would be sewing patches for the enemy next. The lesson was clear. Innovation without permission looks like insubordination. Calvin never wanted permission. He didn't want glory or orders. He wanted one simple thing: for a gun to keep firing when everything else failed. And that stubborn, unglamorous aim would be the only thing that mattered when the forest closed in. Bare hands, but it was useless. The links had frozen solid. The cokes jammed next. For a heartbeat, the forest was silent except for the groan of engines and the thump of shells somewhere deeper in the line. "Main gun only," the commander shouted. "Keep her breathing." Calvin nodded, hauling another 75mm round up from the rack. But he could feel the rhythm breaking down. The Sherman's world was all smoke and noise now. Shell casings clattering, hydraulic hiss, shouted ranges, the dull roar of a dying engine nearby. Through the slit of vision, he saw the panzers pushing closer, infantry like dark ants fanning through the trees. Then came the worst sound of all: click. Empty. The machine guns, both of them, were dead. The last workable belt lay under his seat, sealed in that burlap sack everyone had mocked. Calvin didn't think. He reached down, tore the sack open, and pulled the handmade belt free. The cloth was stiff but pliable, wax glistening in the faint light. He fed it into the receiver, hands shaking not from fear but from focus. The gunner glanced at him. "You're kidding me." "Feed it," Calvin said. He slammed the bolt forward, hit the trigger, and the Browning roared. "No jam. No hesitation." A clean, rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk that cut through the snow like a heartbeat. The gunner blinked, then grinned. "It's feeding." Tracer fire stitched the treeline. German infantry dropped. The panzers stalled, unsure where the new stream of fire had come from. Calvin's belt spat brass until the turret floor was slick with casings. For the next 4 hours, Lion Charlie 4 refused to die. They held the ridge alone, the homemade belt cycling flawlessly while the rest of the platoon burned around them. When the firing finally eased and the forest fell quiet except for the wind and the ticking of cooling metal, for men were still alive inside one battered Sherman. Calvin slumped back, hands blackened with soot and wax. The spent belt coiled at his feet like a relic. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't pretty. But it worked. And in that frozen corner of the Ardennes, that was the only rule that mattered. His face streaked with sweat and soot despite the freezing air. "You realize," he gasped, "this damn thing shouldn't even work." Calvin didn't answer. His hands were raw, the fingertips bleeding through torn gloves as he fed another section of the belt. The waxed cloth slid cleanly, rhythmically, like it had been built by a factory, not a farm boy. Each burst echoed through the trees, tracing lines of smoke through the snow. The coaxial barrel glowed red. The smell of gunpowder, oil, and burnt fabric filled the cramped steel box they called home. Lieutenant Jarvis gritted his teeth, scanning through the periscope. "Hold it, boys. Hold it. God damn it, they're pulling back." Outside, the forest was chaos. German troops scattered between the trees, dragging their wounded. A half-track burned near the ridge, its ammo cooking off in small flashes. Another panzer sat immobilized, smoke venting from its engine block. The Sherman crew didn't celebrate. There was no time. Calvin was already pulling the last of his belts from the sack, steady and silent, feeding it through as the gunner adjusted his aim. Rounds slammed into the trees, kicking up frozen bark and snow. For a brief, unreal moment, the battlefield became pure noise. No orders, no fear, just motion and survival. Inside Lion Charlie 4, they worked like parts of one living engine. Jarvis called targets. Hall fired. Briggs fed. The driver, Olson, kept their angle steady despite shrapnel rattling off the hull like hail. Hours blurred. Each minute stretched like wire ready to snap. Twice shells landed close enough to rock the Sherman onto its treads. Once, a direct hit tore open the tank beside them. Flames licking the sky, but they stayed, teeth clenched, hearts hammering. The only tank left on the ridge. And still the gun never jammed. When the ammo finally ran dry, the forest was silent again, save for the hiss of cooling metal and the whisper of snow settling on wrecks. Calvin sat back, shoulders trembling, watching steam rise from the smoking barrel. His belt, stitched by hand, mocked by everyone, hung in tatters, blackened but whole. Lieutenant Jarvis removed his headset, stunned. "Briggs," he said quietly, almost reverently, "whatever the hell you made, you just saved all of us." Calvin didn't answer right away. He just stared at the belt, the loops dark with powder, and finally muttered, "Just needed it to work." Outside, dawn was finally breaking, gray, cold, and merciless. The forest was a graveyard of steel. But in one battered Sherman, 4 men were still alive. And somewhere beneath the smoke, buried in snow and blood, a legend had been born. Not in a laboratory or a command tent, but in the calloused hands of a farm boy who refused to let his gun fall silent. Layers of waxed canvas, salvaged tent fabric, even parachute webbing. Every belt bore the same handmade signature. Uneven stitching, rough seams, and a smell of oil and sweat. Yet every one of them worked. By Christmas week, the name Briggs belt had spread through half the division. Tank crews swapped cigarettes and chocolate for a single length of Calvin's cloth. Mechanics traded spare bolts and rations just to get the pattern. Nobody cared that it wasn't regulation anymore. In the Ardennes, survival was the regulation. The birth of a field legend. Battalion reports later called it improvised ammunition feed improvement. Non-standard, but effective. Unofficially, the men called it the stitch. Within days, entire platoons were running on Calvin's design. The engineers at headquarters tried to reverse engineer it, but they couldn't replicate the exact flexibility. His secret lay in the simplicity, the cotton weave, the wax blend, the tension of each loop. Things you couldn't measure with a ruler, only feel with your hands. Lieutenant Jarvis made sure the right people noticed. He wrote up a full field report. Loader Calvin Briggs, 22, devised and tested a waxcloth ammunition belt capable of continuous feed under freezing conditions. No misfires observed over 500 rounds. Improvised method sustained fire beyond expected limits. It wasn't flowery, but it was enough. Copies of that report began to circulate among logistics officers, then to ordnance teams, then to Corps Command. And while generals debated and engineers analyzed, the soldiers at the front simply used it. Between smoke and silence, Calvin never thought of himself as an inventor. When they found him days later, sitting beside a field stove with wax-stained hands, he was still working. His thumb was bandaged, his uniform frayed, but his focus never broke. When asked what he called it, he shrugged. "It's just a belt that doesn't freeze." The war ground on, but the tide was turning. The German offensive lost momentum, and by early January, the Ardennes belonged once again to the Allies. Tanks rolled forward through roads carved by fire and snow. Many bore belts that Calvin's hands or his pattern had helped make. When the last shot of that battle was fired, the ridge where Lion Charlie 4 stood was nothing but scarred earth and iron bones. Yet among the wrecks, Calvin's belt still lay coiled where it had fallen. Blackened, stiff, but unbroken. The aftermath. Weeks later, in a rear camp near Namur, Calvin was summoned to a logistics briefing. Officers he didn't know stood around a table covered in blueprints and field reports. A colonel looked up from a folder marked, "Ammunition Feed Reliability Ardennes." "Private Briggs," he said, "you realize you may have just solved a problem the Ordnance Department's been chasing for 2 years. Calvin blinked, unsure how to answer. He just nodded. "I only wanted it to work, sir." The colonel smiled faintly. "Well, son, it did." They offered him a commendation and reassignment to an ordnance division in France. He accepted, though reluctantly. Part of him missed the crew, the tank, the cold rhythm of battle. But another part understood. His hands were more valuable here than in a turret. Legacy in thread and fire. By spring of 1945, a revised field circular referenced flexible, wax-treated cloth feed mechanisms for sustained automatic fire in sub-zero environments. It didn't carry his name, but everyone on that ridge remembered. The mechanics joked that Calvin Briggs had stitched the line shut. After the war, when he returned to Kentucky, his mother said he worked on tractors the same way he had on tanks. Quiet, patient, with an instinct for things that needed fixing. He never spoke much about the battle. But in a small wooden box under his bed, wrapped in oilcloth, he kept one relic. A single length of that blackened, waxed belt. The loops were scorched, the thread brittle, but the cloth still held its shape. And for the rest of his life, whenever he ran a thumb over those burned stitches, he would remember the sound of the gun that never jammed, the men who stopped laughing, and the morning when a simple act of stubborn craftsmanship rewrote the rules of survival. Final rewrite. The quiet fixer. They added extra stitching. different loop sizes, oil-based sealants. None were quite as perfect as the original, but they worked. And more than that, they gave the crews something priceless: confidence. Because in war, nothing kills faster than hesitation. And nothing causes hesitation faster than a weapon you can't trust. Thanks to a 22-year-old farm kid from Kentucky, there was one less thing to fear inside a Sherman. Calvin Briggs never gave speeches. He never asked for credit. But when another loader came to him and asked, "How does it feed so smooth?" he'd kneel beside them, lay out the cotton strip, and explain. Patiently, precisely, humbly. He didn't teach invention. He taught care, the belief that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. For men surrounded by chaos, that care became sacred. Because in a world of breaking machines and broken men, Calvin Briggs made something that held. The war ended 5 months later, May 8, 1945. The world danced. London roared. New York wept. But in a quiet field hospital near Liège, Belgium, Calvin slept for the first time in days. By then, Briggs' belts had reached 3 divisions. They were never official issue, never printed in a manual. But they were copied, shared, and whispered about by soldiers who owed them their lives. He was offered a Bronze Star. He declined. "The heroes," he said, "are the ones who didn't come home." When he returned to Kentucky, the farm was still standing, barely. His father was gone. His younger brother had kept the place alive as best he could. Calvin picked up where he'd left off, fixing tractors, welding gates, mending what was broken. He married June, a schoolteacher, raised 2 kids, and lived the quiet life of a man who didn't need to be remembered. But sometimes letters arrived. A tank commander from the 99th, a supply officer from Bastogne, a crewman who wrote simply, "You don't know me, but your belt worked. Because of it, I got to see my daughter turn 1. Calvin never replied. He didn't have to. He hadn't built it for thanks. He built it because something didn't work, and he couldn't live with that. Decades passed. Each December, he'd go to the barn, open a dusty box, and unroll a faded strip of cloth, dark, frayed, and stiff with age. His son once asked, "Did you really shoot the Germans with that?" Calvin smiled. "No," he said, "but I helped someone who did. That was enough." He died in 1989, quietly, after repairing the same tractor he'd worked on with his father before the war. No monuments bear his name. No textbooks mention him. But ask anyone who fought in the Ardennes, and they might remember a tank that wouldn't die, a gun that never jammed, and a quiet man who stitched life into a belt while the world froze around him. War is remembered in numbers, divisions, casualties, tonnage, cost. But behind every number is a face, a pair of hands, a single act that changed everything. Calvin Briggs didn't win the war. He didn't lead a charge or take a city. He never made the papers. But for 4 hours, in a forest of ice and fire, when everything else failed, his invention worked. Because it wasn't built by a factory. It was built by understanding, by failure, by stubborn determination. And when the world demanded good enough, Calvin Briggs refused. That's what heroism looks like. Not banners or medals, but a young man, hunched over a lamp, measuring thread against empty casings, sewing in silence while everyone laughed, and proving, when the smoke cleared, that one person can make all the difference.